Hello and welcome to our third lecture on the Second World War. In this lecture, we're going to focus on the reasons for the failure of the international system to meet the threat of German foreign policy in the 1930s. We'll examine the dilemmas of British, French, and Soviet foreign policy, as well as the problem of isolationism confronted by Franklin Roosevelt in the United States. Then finally, we'll conclude with the treatment of the major international crises of 1938 and 1939 as Europe moved relentlessly toward the outbreak of war. In 1936, with the Olympic Games, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, Germany had announced its return as a major power in Europe. In addition, in 1936, Hitler would introduce the so-called four-year plan, an economic plan to make Germany self-sufficient within 4 years, economically self-sufficient, to confront the dangers of an increasingly challenging international situation. And as I said in the last lecture, I think it's extremely important to understand over and over and over again, in 1936, 37, 38, Hitler would constantly emphasize his desire for peace. Anyone who thinks that I want war, he would routinely say, doesn't understand anything at all about me personally. After all, unlike some of the other statesmen of the period, I was a soldier at the front during the First World War, during the Great War. I know what it was like. I know what the suffering of the trenches was like, and I don't want to plunge Europe back into anything like this. All I want is for Germany to be restored to its rightful place in the international community, for Germany once again to be the major power that it should be and to be treated like an equal. By 1936, he had gone a long way toward restoring Germany. And with each of these steps, which certainly led to the piecemeal dismantling of the Treaty of Versailles, each was couched in the same defensive, reasonable sort of demeanor of his. One tends to think of Hitler as this sort of ranting maniac if we see the film clips, especially if one doesn't understand German. It just sounds sort of like this high-pitched shrieking, where the point is to say Deutschland as many times in 30 seconds as he possibly can. But invariably, Hitler had a set routine the way he would speak. It was always, he would warm himself up, and it would always begin, when he was talking about foreign policy, there would be a long list of the various privations of Germany, the unfair treatment of Germany, and his very reasonable, peaceful determination to see justice prevail. By 1936, it was clear that the momentum was running all in Hitler's direction. The wartime alliance against Germany had certainly was badly fractured, and France especially found itself in an impossible situation. Confronted by Hitler's relentless pressure, France cast about for allies, cast about for some sort of workable policy to confront this growing German threat. But France in the 1930s was paralyzed in very important ways. There was political polarization in France during the Depression. The Depression in France was not as dramatic as it was in the United States or Germany, with massive unemployment, runs on the banks, failing businesses, and so on. It was a long, protracted economic agony. French political life fragmented in the 1930s. The Popular Front government had come to power in 1936 on the left. It was confronted by a right wing in France that was convinced that the Third Republic was simply corrupt, incapable of managing French affairs, and so on. And so while there was a clear perception of a German challenge, a fear of German revival, there was simply a lack of any kind of political consensus or political will to meet that challenge. No agreement about the necessity of rebuilding the armed forces or modernizing the armed forces, of adopting any sort of new strategy to meet changing times. In fact, it is in the 1930s that one sees what might be called the Maginot mentality really come to the fore. The French in the late 20s had embarked upon a defensive scheme to protect the eastern frontier of France from German invasion. They had begun to erect extraordinary fortifications, a line of fortifications basically from the Swiss frontier up the borders of Alsace and Lorraine over to the Dutch frontier. Enormous concrete pillboxes. It was state-of-the-art, static defensive positions that the French were creating. This Maginot Line, as it came to be known, was in fact symptomatic of French problems in the interwar years. French military thinking was fighting the First World War. It was fighting the Great War of the Trenches, a war in which he who occupied the defensive position had the advantage. There was no sense at all of the possibilities of mobility. There was a great deal of discussion in France, in Britain, and in Germany about the use of armor, the use of aircraft to create a more mobile, more flexible battlefield. Charles de Gaulle, a young colonel in France, had already talked about this. He had been a tank commander in the Great War. Had talked about the need to move beyond this defensive mentality that the French military seemed to be mired in. But it was to no avail. France was simply unwilling at this point to embark upon any more ambitious military program to confront this German challenge. An interesting aspect of the Maginot Line, of course, too, is that the Maginot Line runs up that frontier of Germany over to the Ardennes forest and stops. It does not continue all along the French frontier with Belgium. And one thinks, well, this is a kind of curious thing. After all, the Germans had invaded France twice since 1870. Neither time had they tried to come where the Maginot Line was constructed, but instead had used this avenue through the Ardennes and then through Belgium during the First War. But the French did not build the Maginot Line, did not extend the Maginot Line across the Belgian frontier. There are several reasons for this that are, I think, important. One is that France had an ambiguous relationship with Belgium. France had guaranteed Belgian sovereignty. It was not a military alliance in the sense that there was not an exchange of information, not an exchange of military or a plan for a coordinated military response to a German invasion. France simply had proclaimed its determination to guarantee Belgium. So for the French, politically, extending the Maginot Line across the frontier with Belgium was a problematic thing. What would your Belgian allies think if what you'd done was to build a fortification along their frontier so that you would simply withdraw behind it? So politically, this was seen as a problematic thing for the French leadership. There were also engineering problems with it as well. As any soldier who had fought on the Western Front in the First World War understood from the experience of trench foot, the water table in northwestern Europe, in this area of the Low Countries, is very high. You dig down a little bit and you hit water. The idea of sinking these enormous concrete fortifications into that terrain was a problem. It was certainly solvable. They could have done it, but it was going to be an engineering feat to do it. It was going to be expensive to do it, and there simply was not in France the will or the determination to do it. France had, in the 1930s, the largest army in Europe west of the Soviet Union. The French army still enjoyed a tremendous reputation as being the great military force on the continent. And the French, on the one hand, in their foreign policy, constantly strove to find some sort of collective security arrangement that we've been talking about, but militarily, there's no follow-through. There is a sort of sense of, well, we know there's a threat, but what is one to do in the end? They mistrusted the British. This British-French relations from the 20s into the 30s were strained for a variety of reasons. The British in particular, as we talked about in the last lecture, had become increasingly convinced that the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh, that it was unenforceable, and that the best thing to do was to meet legitimate demands of the Germans for change, for revision of the treaty. But each one of those was one more nail in the coffin of the collective security arrangements that the French had hoped to see. The French then were looking for allies, someone they could trust, someone that they could rely upon in this context. In 1935, a new opportunity presented itself. In 1935, the Soviet Union decided that it too was directly challenged by the revival of German power. Stalin was ready for some sort of arrangement with the Western powers, especially after 1934 when Germany had signed this 10-year non-aggression pact with Poland. To the Soviets, this looked like the Germans encroaching into Eastern Europe. Why were they making a deal with the Poles? Was this to be a spearhead for some sort of Polish-German alliance that could be directed against the Soviet Union? And in this sense, Stalin, and being trustful was not one of Stalin's great strong suits, I think. Stalin was convinced that something no good was afoot here. He saw this as a threat, and the Soviet Union would reverse its position. It would enter the League of Nations. It would seek to break its status as an outsider state, a pariah nation. And he named as his foreign secretary Maxim Litvinov, who became a major advocate of collective security. Litvinov, more than any other Soviet leader, was associated with building bridges to Western Europe, maintaining some sort of collective security arrangement that would protect the Soviet Union and Western Europe from German aggression. The Soviet Union also, in the same spirit, in 1935, signed an agreement with Czechoslovakia, in which the Soviets pledged to come to Czechoslovakia's aid if it were attacked by another party. Well, the other party was clearly Germany. This is what everyone understood. But Stalin did not trust the French or the Czechs terribly about this. France had an agreement with Czechoslovakia, so Stalin wrote language into the agreement with the Czechs which said the Soviet Union would come to Czechoslovakia's aid if France first honored its obligations to the Czechs. Stalin was worried that what the West would do was trying to channel German aggression eastward. And so what Stalin didn't want to do was to pledge to go to Czechoslovakia's aid along with the French, only to have the French back out and leave them in the lurch. There was another small problem for the Russians with this aid to Czechoslovakia, and that is that in the 1930s and until after the Second World War, there was no common frontier between Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union. They were going to have to pass through Polish territory, and the Poles were not terribly keen on the idea of the Red Army passing across Polish territory to aid the Czechs. Nonetheless, this agreement with Czechoslovakia in 1935 indicated that the Soviet Union was interested in becoming the counterweight in the East that France had been seeking. In addition, Stalin instructed the Comintern to urge communist parties in Western Europe to cooperate with socialists and liberals in forming popular front governments. Up until this point, the official Comintern position, the official Soviet position, was that the greatest danger in the Western European states was not fascism at all, but rather corrupt social democracy. Now in 1935, they reversed themselves on this and say, well, now what we need to do is to build bridges to the socialists, even the liberals, form popular fronts in order to meet this mounting fascist threat. So one has an uneasy Soviet-French relationship evolving in the mid-1930s as each, mistrustful of the other, but concerned about Germany, tries to find some way through this thicket. Italy was another possibility for the French. Italy had initially been a likely candidate to help France defend the treaty. Mussolini, one would think ideologically certainly a brethren of Hitler. Mussolini was in many ways Hitler's model. Hitler was always very fond of him, respected him. But Mussolini in this period was concerned about German penetration of the Balkans. In 1934, the Nazis had attempted to overthrow the Austrian government. The Austrian Nazis had. Whether Berlin was involved directly, one doesn't know, but certainly the Germans weren't unhappy with this. It had led to the assassination of the Austrian dictator Dollfuss. It was a fiasco. The Austrian Nazis were put down. But the French, the Italians, and the British all rallied to Austria's support, that is, to support them against the possibility of German encroachment here. So there was some real possibility that Italy could be seen as a counterweight. The Italians didn't want to see German influence extend down into the Balkans. But In late 1935, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. And when he did, England and France condemned his move. And in the following year, their opposition to his involvement in the Spanish Civil War, Mussolini came to the aid of Francisco Franco. When this occurred, it simply drove a wedge between fascist Italy and the Western democracies. By 1936, Mussolini was already talking about a Rome-Berlin axis. And in 1937, Italy would actually sign the Anti-Comintern Pact with Nazi Germany. So by the mid-30s, Italy has already removed itself as a possible counterweight to the Germans. The Soviets are a possibility, but still problematic. The Germans, meanwhile, were hardly standing still. In November of 1937, Hitler called a top-secret meeting of his top foreign policy advisors and military men. It was a discussion about general aims and objectives of the regime in foreign policy. During what was a typical sort of Hitler rambling discussion that went on for some time, Hitler talked about the need for Lebensraum. He talked about the need for expansion to the east, that what his job would be to isolate his opponents diplomatically, and that Germany should be prepared in the future to deal with a situation in the east, an attack on Poland, and also to face the possibility of a French attack in the west. In other words, what Hitler told his diplomats and his generals is, we're at some point in the future, it was not clear exactly when, Germany ought to be prepared for a move into Eastern Europe, which would probably bring it into conflict with France. Hopefully not with Great Britain, but certainly with France. No notes were allowed to be taken at this meeting. It was top secret, but one colonel did keep notes, a man by the name of Friedrich Hossbach, and this has gone down into the record as the Hossbach Memorandum. It's important because, on the one hand, it looks like in 1937, before the great turmoil of 1938 and 1939, that Hitler was already thinking very consistently about precise moves in foreign policy. The debate is whether or not this was sort of typical Hitlerian rhetoric, where he's talking about taking a sort of tour of the horizon of possibilities, or whether this really does represent a blueprint for action. But I think what's interesting about it is that within months, in fact within weeks, the Minister of War, General Blumberg, was removed. The Commander-in-Chief of the Army, General Fritsch, was removed, and the Foreign Minister, Baron von Neurath, was removed. All three men had voiced their, not opposition to Hitler's plans, this would have been too much, one simply didn't do this, even in 1937, but had raised concerns, in effect saying, Mein Führer, do you really mean to suggest that we're going to enter into the possibility of a two-front war? Or are you really talking about war against Poland and then possibly war with France, possibly Britain? What about the Soviet Union? They raised all sorts of perfectly reasonable, legitimate sorts of concerns that you would expect foreign policy and military advisors to do. And within 2 months, they were all gone. Removed. Joachim von Ribbentrop, a Nazi with no real background in foreign policy, was named foreign minister. Hitler himself would move to consolidate the military positions in his own hands. And so as 1938 began, Hitler was in exactly the position that he hoped to be in. The horizon seemed relatively clear. He had a potential friend in Mussolini. The West seemed to be in disarray. And then in February of 1938, a situation fell into his lap, which was ideal for an opportunist like Hitler to deal with. The Austrian government, since 1934, had been very nervous about Nazi intentions. This attempt to overthrow the Austrian government by Austrian Nazis, as we've seen, had been squashed by the Austrian government. But there was still concern that the Germans were funneling money to these Austrian Nazis, that they were fomenting trouble within Austria, and that the Germans had designs on the Austrian state. In early 1938, the Austrian chancellor, by the name of Schuschnigg, began taking feelers with the British and with the Italians about possibly guaranteeing Austrian sovereignty. This was leaked. Hitler interpreted this as a breach of any sort of relationship between Germany and Austria, inconsistent with their attempts to rebuild their relationship after the 1934 fiasco. And a crisis seemed to be in the offing. Now, the German ambassador in Austria at this time was a man by the name of Franz von Papen. Ironically enough, he'd been the last pre-Nazi chancellor of Germany. Hitler had earmarked him for assassination in 1934, but the guy had more lives than a cat. Had survived that. Surfaces in 1938 as the ambassador to Austria and suggests something that was quite rare, indeed almost unheard of at the time. We now take it for granted. It was, what about a little summit diplomacy? Why not have Chancellor Schuschnigg from Austria come up from Vienna while the Fuhrer is down at his home in the Bavarian Alps close to Salzburg, have a face-to-face meeting, iron out these difficulties, and so on. Schuschnigg departed from Vienna, traveling, it's remarkable thinking about this, with a very small entourage, arrives in Munich where he thinks he's going to meet with Hitler, and instead is then taken in a large motorcade out through Bavaria, out to Berchtesgaden, and then taken up to Hitler's house on this Alp that overlooks this extraordinary scene in Bavaria, close to Salzburg. But they don't stop at the so-called Berghof, which was Hitler's actual residence, but began winding their way around this very tiny, typical Alpine road, all the way into a parking lot right beside just the side of a mountain. Schuschnigg and just a handful of advisors climb out of the cars, look over, and are being escorted over to these two enormous doors that open into the side of the mountain, and they see stretching in front of them a long corridor with torches about every 10 yards or so. Beneath each torch, a uniformed SS man, a Schutzstaffel man, white gloves, black uniform, helmet, bayonet out. They walk down this long corridor into the mountain, climb into a small room. Actually, the room is, well, it's about like this area here, gold-plated. Schuschnigg is standing there not knowing what's going on. He hears a sort of odd humming noise in the background and then suddenly realizes that the room is moving. The room was in fact an elevator, and it was taking Schuschnigg, Ribbentrop and company up. The doors swing open, and there is Hitler standing in front of the elevator doorway, and behind him is the entire general staff of the German army. It is, one can actually retrace these steps. All of these things are still there. The road, this eagle's nest, as it was called, at the top of this Alp, that literally is perched right on a peak of the Alps. One could not feel more isolated. I go into this detail not simply for the sort of local color of it, but because it was the way that Hitler liked to do things. It put Schuschnigg in this position of vulnerability. He thought he was going for a discussion, a typical sort of diplomatic discussion that would take place in offices in Munich. Suddenly discover he's going to Hitler's residence in Berchtesgaden, only it's not really that. And there he winds up on top of this mountain with Hitler and the German general staff. Hitler didn't waste much time. He demanded, absolutely insisted upon, Austrian acquiescence in freeing all the Austrian Nazis, coordination of German foreign policy, military policy with Austria, and so on. In effect, what Hitler was talking about was the absorption of Austria by Germany. Schuschnigg managed to collect himself, to get off the Alp without committing himself to anything, so they had to go back to Vienna, obviously. Went back, and then, to Hitler's great astonishment, Schuschnigg announced plans for a plebiscite to be held on March 13th. This was too much. At this point, Germany demanded that Schuschnigg call off the plebiscite or face war. Schuschnigg did call off the plebiscite. The German troops poured across the frontier into Austria, and Hitler returned to the country of his birth, passing through Braunau, where he was born, Linz, where he grew up, and then into Vienna, where he had spent the unhappiest years of his life, to a cheering throng and announced the annexation of Austria. The international response was mild, to say the least. How did Hitler justify what he had done with Austria? It was clear. This was perfectly consistent with the principles espoused by Woodrow Wilson and the Allies at Versailles. National self-determination of peoples. In 1918, 1919, the Austrians, the sort of rump Austrian state, populated by ethnic Germans, had wanted to be part of the new German state. Only the Allies had said, no, this can't happen. France and Britain had not fought for 4 years in order to make Germany larger than it had been in 1914. And so that linkage, this union of Germany and Austria, had been forbidden. So what does Hitler do in 1938 in March? It's national self-determination of peoples. This is not an aggressive act. It is not a demand of German foreign policy run rampant. It is simply a justified act of national self-determination. Hitler was not through in 1938. The summer would pass with a mounting crisis over Czechoslovakia. The Allies had been hamstrung in their response to the Austrian case, and now it seemed as if Austria was resolved, but now Czechoslovakia had been moved onto the front burner. The mountainous area around Bohemia, this part of Czechoslovakia that extends into Germany in the east, the Sudetenland it was called, was populated to a very large extent by ethnic Germans. And in 1938, in the spring and summer of 1938, encouraged by the Nazis in Germany, Konrad Himmlein and the Sudeten Germans began demanding autonomy for the ethnic Germans in Czechoslovakia, arguing that they were being repressed by the Czech state, that all they wanted was national self-determination of peoples. They wanted to come, as the term was, heim ins Reich, to return to the Reich. This policy was clearly supported by the National Socialist regime. The Czechs, fearful of a replay of the Anschluss, this linkage of union of Germany and Austria, the Czech government mobilized its forces. They're going to fight. Czechoslovakia, certainly Bohemia with its mountainous terrain, was a very tough area for an invasion. The German military was not keen on the possibility of an invasion at all. And the Czech army was well trained and well equipped. So Hitler was furious. He'd been shown up now by the Czechs. He wasn't ready to push the situation. And so the summer lapsed without any sort of solution to this mounting, what was now being called the crisis of the Sudetenland. But in the fall, late summer, early fall, Hitler told his military people, prepare for an invasion of Czechoslovakia by October 1st, while publicly stating all he wanted was to defend the rights of ethnic Germans in Czechoslovakia. At this point, in the fall of 1938, two people stepped in to save the day, to save the peace. One was Mussolini, who was nervous as a cat at this point, having rattled his saber. I suppose more appropriately for Mussolini would be to pound his chest, since he was fond of ripping off his shirt there at the Palazzo there in Rome. Despite all of this, despite his invasion of Ethiopia, his involvement in the Spanish Civil War, Mussolini was not at all keen on being dragged into war, possibly with France, maybe with the Soviet Union, maybe with Britain, over what? The Sudetenland? No way. So he found an ally in the British Prime Minister by the name of Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain had become Prime Minister in May of 1937, and he would become the foremost exponent of a policy that we've come to know as appeasement. It was not his policy. He was not the originator of the term or of the policy. It had been, in fact, British policy almost since the end of the First World War to meet reasonable German demands for revision of the treaty, to deal with the Germans from a position of strength, yes, but to realize that the treaty had probably been too harsh and to therefore meet what could be argued were reasonable demands. As far as Chamberlain was concerned, this was the only alternative. The French, he viewed, were weak, unreliable. The French army might be huge, but he had no confidence whatsoever in its ability to actually pull off a defense of Czechoslovakia. The Americans were worse. The Americans were unreliable. We were wallowing in isolationism. And the other thing for Chamberlain, this is an important point that we'll come back to, Chamberlain was mistrustful of American interests in the long haul. This special relationship between the United States and Britain is largely a creation of Churchill and Roosevelt. It certainly was not Chamberlain's policy. In 1938, Chamberlain was afraid that if a war came, any war, that it would lead to a decline of the British Empire and an emergence of real American power. So Britain would be reduced to the status of a second-class citizen behind the United States. And then finally, Chamberlain had also learned his lessons from the summer of 1914. What would be worth another war? What issue, what problem would justify throwing Europe once again into this great cataclysm where millions of young men and women would die? The Sudetenland in Germany, in Czechoslovakia, you couldn't probably have found a room full of people in Britain who could have found it on a map, maybe even in the Foreign Office. And so, for Chamberlain, the point was meet reasonable demands. Deal with the Germans honestly, deal with Hitler from a position of strength, certainly, but be ready to compromise. The result, as we all know, was the conference held on September 30th of 1938 in Munich, in which Chamberlain, Daladier of France, Mussolini, and Hitler presided over the annexation of the Sudetenland by Germany. That conference was a major turning point in the prelude to the Second World War, and the implications of which we will take up in our next lecture.